So we're here tonight to talk about young Earth and the evidence for that. Just give a little introduction real fast, though, because I think this can be a really tough topic to talk about, in my opinion, because it's not as simple as just showing some scientific facts to say, no, this is what the science shows, to prove that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, as the biblical timeline gives us. We have to also dispel common beliefs that have been kind of thrust on us or kids in school by today's culture. And it's taught to us as a known fact, like undeniable known fact. This is one of the things that made this such a really tough topic for me when I was becoming a Christian and things. Just feeling like, well, what about common sense that has been taught to me? You know, all this stuff is just common sense. Well, first I mentioned 6,000 years old. Where do we get this timeline? We get this timeline because we know that between Adam and Abraham, there were roughly 2,000 years. Then from Abraham to Jesus, there were roughly 2,000 years. And then from Jesus to today, there's another 2,000 years. There are some Christians who have a different belief, and this is called the gap theory. And this is the theory that God, when he created the earth, he created an old-looking earth, an old-appearing earth. So an earth that already had dinosaurs fossilized in it, or animals were already present. And then there was a long period where God didn't do anything between day 5 and 6, or maybe between day 6 and just whenever he created man in day 6. Like maybe it wasn't an actual day, maybe it was metaphoric. And so there may have been this really, really long gap before God completed his work. The idea is, you know, when God created Adam, he didn't create little baby infant Adam who then had to grow up and become an adult. He created an adult Adam. And then when Jesus turned water into wine, the wine was really, really good wine, not like some cheap 30-second old wine that didn't even have time to ferment or anything. It was wine that went through the whole process, which took time. So that's kind of the idea, is even Christians, they'll diverge on this topic. The problem with the gap theory is, I've got a slide that kind of explains it. What it's saying is, when God completed his work and he looked at all creation and he said, this is good, that would mean that all of the pain and death, disease, thorns, mass extinction, all those dead animals, all death in general, he was calling good too. If we believe that he created an old earth that just had death and all of these bad things in it, we find dinosaurs that had abscesses, that had cancer, that were deformed at birth. So you would have to believe that God called those things good as well when he said all things he created are good. So that's where I have an issue with the gap theory. The difference, there is a difference between scientific facts and science being abused and twisted in order to fit your worldview. And Christians can do this too. But the true scientific method is objective. It doesn't matter, or it doesn't care if you believe the earth is 6,000 years old or billions of years old. What does the scientific evidence show? That's objective. That's not something that's going to change because of our worldview. But the way we interpret evidence is what causes, that's where the change comes in. So if a Christian drills a hole in the earth and finds all these fossils, we can find evidence for a worldwide flood, which grouped all these fossils, all these creatures together, because our worldview is that the world is 6,000 years old, if it is that, if that's what your worldview is, I mean. But if a secular scientist does that same test, and they have the presupposition that the earth is billions of years old, that everything had to evolve in order to be what it is today, then they will interpret that same evidence differently because they have a different worldview. So I would argue that secular scientists, it's not that science is at odds with Christianity, it's that if you believe in God, you interpret the evidence one way. If you don't believe in God, you interpret it another way. I think there's also this immense trust that we place in scientists today, and we should respect their knowledge, their education, their expertise in their field. But the moment a scientist begins making claims about the past that they were not there to observe and that there is no scientific certainty, they're just making observations off of their opinion. They've left their area of expertise. They're no longer speaking from a scientific point of view. They're speaking from a presumptuous point of view. And us normal folk will look at them and say, well, they're smarter than me. Who am I to argue with them? They must know what they're talking about. They're educated, so they must be right. And this is kind of, not to go too far off topic, but the trust that has been placed in psychiatrists. There are, from the time in the 60s till today, there's been so many books produced on parenting that if you stacked them up, they would stack all the way up to the moon. And almost none of them would actually say the same thing. They all have new ideas, new things to try. And if you look at our parenting track record, it's not like we're getting better at being parents as time goes on. If anything, we're getting a lot worse. And so sometimes we just place an unnecessary amount of trust in people with degrees that really the trust should have been placed in the Bible or in God instead. There's nowhere else in the Bible where we would take the word day and interpret it as meaning something metaphoric like people try to do in Genesis. We don't treat the account of the Israelites marching around Jericho as though it was a metaphorical time frame, but it's only in Genesis that we then start to say, well, maybe that doesn't actually mean a day, because it's difficult to understand Genesis from a 21st century American worldview. I don't think people are not saved if they don't believe in a young earth. So this is not a salvation issue. It's more of a trust issue. And that's the main point that I want to get at is, do we trust God and his word? And if we do, then we also have to trust the accounts of Genesis, because Genesis is not meant to be a metaphorical book or allegorical. It's a book of history. If we start compromising our faith in God's word in Genesis, where does that line of reasoning end? Where else are we going to compromise our belief in God's word? If whenever there's something that we can't harmonize with our culture today, or whatever the popular opinion is among man, if we then try to explain God's word into something that it's not portraying itself as, then we're just compromising. When it comes to Christians looking at the Bible regarding the resurrection, the virgin birth, Jesus walking on water, the resurrection of Lazarus, the healing of the blind, crossing the Red Sea, Jonah and the great fish, and on and on and on, we would never take what the secular world is saying about that thing, or take what the secular world is saying in general and take something from outside the Bible and use that to interpret these stories. There are probably some people out there who do this, but if we're being honest with Scripture and taking it as it is written, we know what it says very clearly. But the exciting thing is, like, kind of the thing I'm really excited about telling people is, you don't have to compromise scientific understanding of the world in order to have faith in the Bible. I think science supports the truths of the Bible, and I'd argue there's that the evidence is contrary to popular belief, because that evidence was interpreted with the presupposition that the earth is millions and billions of years old and the non-existence of God. So we'll go into some geology real quick, some geological evidence. And in 2 Peter 3:3 and in 5 through 6, well, actually, I don't have that pulled up. I'm sorry. So in Genesis, Satan asks Adam and Eve, did God really say that? And that's what caused them to start doubting God, doubting what God had already told them. And I believe he's asking us that same question today whenever we consider whether or not the accounts in Genesis are literal or a fable. We need to ask ourselves if we're willing to take God at his word and believe that he did what he said he did. There are three truths about Genesis, about the Genesis flood that we need to look at. First, it was global. Then it was catastrophic. These waves, they would have been tsunami-sized waves. They would have been very catastrophic. And that's why we find land-dwelling dinosaurs 75 miles offshore of any continents, and no sharks or scavengers had eaten them. Well, how did they get all the way out there? Maybe they were washed out by massive flood waves. The final truth is that it was recent, and I believe the evidence we find proves this. Earth is the only planet that has plates that move. And here's a just kind of a diagram of the lithosphere and the direction that it'll dive off and head towards. When it gets cold, it dives off, heads towards the crust, gets heated up, and basically recycled over and over again. Once the crust reaches that temperature, the Christian belief would be that when it dove off really, really quickly, started going down really, really fast. Whereas the secular belief is that it was really, really slow. It took a really long time for those plates to sink. But the idea is, if this subduction did happen really, really quickly, it's like a sinker in the water. It would just plummet. And we can actually view these subduction zones today. When we view them and do temperature scans, it shows that these plates are still really, really cold. But that makes no sense if it took millions or billions of years to sink, because they would have melted and would be way hotter than they are. But they're still cold. There's a layer of the earth that's referred to as the basalt-salc lithology. And this layer is made up of sand, and it's found throughout the globe. The same sand that's found in North America is found at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And the idea of progressive flooding matches Genesis 7 through 8. It took 40 days for the floodwaters to reach Noah's boat. And then the flood lasted 150 days. So it wasn't a 40-day flood like some people think. It's actually a 150-day flood. 40 days is when it reached the boat. Day 40 in geology, so if you drill down in this basalt-salc lithology, day 40 is where we would find these global coal deposits. And then again on day 150, which is where the highest elevations would have been flooded. Huge coal seams are found miles off the shores on continents, off the shores of continents, which is evidence that all the organic material is washed off. And then most fossils are found in these bone beds that are a few feet thick. An interesting thing about these fossil beds, they show mixed environments, such as fish being buried with birds or land animals being buried with aquatic animals. And there's evidence that it happened really, really quickly, so not over a very long time span. There are fossilized animals that are still eating other animals when they were fossilized, when they were buried. There are these footprints that are fossilized that are frozen in time. And if footprints would have been fossilized the normal process, erosion takes place, and whether it's from rain or just natural erosion happens over time, then these footprints would not have lasted. They would have been eroded away. There's even a fossil of two dinosaurs that were buried while still fighting each other. So one has the arm of the other in its mouth. It's a velociraptor and triceratops, little triceratops. And so they're frozen, still fighting to death. Even secular scientists agree that these guys had to be buried really, really quickly, but their explanation is that a mudslide must have done it. There's just a random mudslide came in and buried them really quickly. But all these things I mentioned could not happen in slow fossilization, only rapid fossilization. We can observe the sequences in the soil at places like the Grand Canyon. Sequences that just look like layers. And what we find is a lack of erosion between the sequences. Here's a picture of the Grand Canyon, and you can see the sequences really well in the Grand Canyon. That's why a lot of people like to study this when talking about this topic. But this lack of erosion makes no sense in an old Earth model. We've also found thigh bones of a T-Rex. I'm not sure that's a T-Rex, but it's a dinosaur bone. And inside these thigh bones, there was soft, malleable tissue. They still had proteins, red blood cells, collagen, and even DNA, which are still present. These things are really, really fragile and deteriorate rapidly. Thought I had another one of the blood vessels, but it's theorized, the lady who found this, they theorized that maybe the iron in the blood, when it was going through the fossilization process, the iron preserved all these elements. But then when they tried to repeat this test, or this theory, with a very high concentrated iron solution, the best they could do was increase the life for about 2 years. And this is with a very controlled environment and an iron solution that's much more concentrated than anything you're going to find in nature. Even the most generous models show that even in perfect condition, these tissues could not be older than between 100,000 years and 1 million years. They deteriorate very quickly. Well, that's perfectly fine for a young Earth model, because we'd say the Earth is only thousands of years old. Next thing I'd like to talk about is some fossils. So the fossils that we find could be even more evidence for a global flood. You can fossilize things really, really quickly if you bury them really, really deep and really, really quickly. And this is consistent with a global flood. You know, water levels would rise, and it would start to cause these tsunami-sized waves. These waves would pick up soil and debris, become kind of like a fast-moving mud wave. And animals and vegetation, as they were overcome by these waves, they'd be drowned and then buried really quickly. And then many layers of sediment would deposit on top of them and would continue to settle on these dead animals and vegetation. And then when the water receded off of the continents after the land began to rise, I'll talk more about that later, but the waters start to recede, more sediment would be moved in vast quantities and would be deposited in the lower regions, kind of like a shower drain. You know, if you are covered in sand or dirt and you take a shower, it kind of gathers right there around that shower drain. Most fossils are found in fossil beds. This is an example of one. And in these fossil beds, over 1,000 different species have been found. There's actually a fossil bed in Wyoming, which measures to an area of about 1 mile by 3 miles, and in it over 10,000 different species of dinosaurs have been found so far. Even this is, it's kind of ironic, this map was taken from a secular worldview page, and somehow it's supposed to refute the Christian view on it, but you see all of the fossils, they don't go over a certain line. You've even got the lowest area here where all of the water would have washed away things and carved the kind of the valley there, or so any fossils that would have been there would have been washed away as the water flowed out. So it's just, I thought it was funny that it's meant to disprove the Christian view, but it ends up just kind of supporting it. So next I'll talk about evolution. And in order to explain evolution, we got to define what evolution is and what it is not. Evolution is when one animal changes into a different kind of animal. A kind is like the family of the species. So an example would be like a dog turning into a cat, or a bird turning into a fish, or a monkey turning into a human. So there's an example of many kinds of dogs, like wolves, dingoes, coyotes, but they're all in the dog family. They're still dogs, they're just different kinds of dogs. Evolution is not the observable changes that we see happen among these animals in each family. So we can breed dogs into these hideous little Chihuahua things, or these giant Great Danes. We breed, those were never around originally. We bred those. But we can never breed a dog into another animal. That's what evolution, the word evolution would refer to. The theory of evolution is that these adaptations that we witness happen in animals occur, they slowly occur, and then over time, given an unlimited amount of time, those changes can then cross those family lines, and they can change into something else. Maybe they start to develop wings and they become a bat. But given enough time, theoretically, they could just become anything you want. The problem is there's no example of this ever happening, any other animal ever crossing that family line, and there's not even any fossil evidence of this. A secular scientist they'll find maybe a fish that has fins that has 5 bones in it, and they'll say, aha, this is it. This is that transitional fossil. See, it started to develop hands. Those 5 bones, that's like the formation of hands, and then they kind of fill in all these blanks. What did it turn into after that? There's no fossils of it ever transitioning farther than that. There's no fossil record of these animals changing into other animals. Maybe there are fish that have fins with no bones, and then some fish that start to develop bones, but they stay fish. They're still fish. They're not turning into anything else. Let's pretend you are a dog breeder for the sake of this discussion, and you want to breed a dog that has a small nose, some sort of dog with small nose. So you find dogs that have small noses from the litter, smaller than normal noses, and you breed them together, and you keep doing that until eventually you have just dogs that have small noses being bred. So before long, what you end up with is just this breed of dog that only has small noses. They can't even have large noses. This is kind of a figure that I found that kind of explains it. If you imagine the blue and the green is from the dad, and the red and the teal or white is from the mom, the different combinations are down below. And this is illustrating that a child is going to get half of the DNA from the mom and the dad, and what half it is random. But there are certain things that are certain possibilities that the child can have. So if the dad has this kind of short hair and the mom has this scraggly hair, it's possible to have 2 different kinds of rabbits with short hair and 2 different kinds of rabbits with long hair. But then if you take the ones with the long hair and you continue doing this, you continue breeding them, eventually they've lost the information that even has the possibility for short hair. So they don't even have the information in their DNA anymore. So what you're observing is a loss of information. When God created us, He created us with all of these different possibilities, all of this different all this information. We were just so diverse. And as you go down the line, though, the information starts to get more and more limited. We never see it. So if you did end up with a breed of just long-haired rabbits, you could not then turn around and breed it back to having short hair. They've lost that information. They don't even have it in their DNA anymore. 50% comes from the mom, 50% comes from the dad, and if their DNA does not have the long hair DNA, then they cannot produce or if they don't have the short hair DNA, then they cannot produce short-haired offspring. So it's a loss of information that's happening. So what ends up happening is they become kind of the end of the line for that breed. A poodle is an example of this. Poodles are the end of the line. If they lost any more information, they would kind of just like melt into a puddle. They don't have anything else they can lose. And you can never start with a poodle. That was a bad analogy. Now I'm going to get stuck on that. But you start with a poodle, two poodles. You can never go back to a wolf or a yellow lab. That's it. You're just going to have poodles. That's what they say. That's what they mean when they say purebred. Purebred is actually a negative thing because they just have this lack of information. This is kind of a funny comic I saw. It says, for a dinosaur to evolve into a bird, there would have to be an increase of genetic information. And the guy says, in other words, the dinosaur would need new information added to its DNA to grow feathers. And the guy says, yes, and science has never observed such an increase of information, but we do observe the loss of information. And then the guy says, well, then why do so many people still believe in evolution? And he holds up his Bible and says, this is just another case of a loss of information. Here is a kind of a graph that just shows the red line is the evolutionary history, and the blue is the biblical creation. But now, what the secular scientists are saying is that for all of history, the human genetics and animal genetics were not diverse at all. They were just like a flat line. And then all of a sudden, several thousand years ago, I'm not sure what their timeline is, if it's accurate with this graph, but all of a sudden, everything diversified, and we get all these different species that we have. Whereas the Christian worldview is that we started with all of that genetic data, and then since then, there's been all these different. So maybe there were just two dogs or one kind of dog, and now we've got all these different kinds of dogs. The lack of archaeological evidence for this belief is one huge problem for the naturalists. Another issue is the model that's proposed in evolution. It says that these random adaptations that occurred were the result of mutation. Mutation is the only way they could introduce new genetic information because things change the way they're not supposed to change. But mutation is a bad thing. You don't want a mutation. Every form of cancer that we have comes from a mutation of some kind. But the naturalists would argue that with an unlimited time frame, that those mutations could cause the gain of only good information. So instead of it turning out to be something bad like cancer, you mutate and only good stuff comes from it. And that's what has allowed animals to change species. But there's no evidence with this with archaeology. We do see small changes happening, like beaks getting smaller or bigger to accommodate the food sources that are available, hair color changing when the environment changes, but we never witness animals becoming different animals. Next, I want to talk about dinosaurs and the Ark. Many people think dinosaurs would have been long extinct by the time of the flood. You know, the flood happened about 4,300 years ago. They've been fossilized for millions and billions of years, so what's the deal with them? But I think there's biblical evidence that they were actually on the ark. In the book of Job, there's a mention of Behemoth, which had bones like brass bars, ribs like iron bars, and a tail that swung like a cedar. People theorize that this could be an elephant, a hippo, or a rhino, but all three of those have really tiny tails. It really sounds like a sauropod, long neck. I mean, this is, if there was going to be a dinosaur that fit the bill, this would be it. Job also mentions Leviathan, which just sounds like a Spinosaurus. And these things were master hunters in the water. And funny thing about this picture, those fish there, those were dinosaur-eating fish. Those fish were really, really large. I think they said they were like the size of a van. They're big, big fish. They would eat dinosaurs. And up until very recently, they thought those fish were extinct, but they found them still alive on Earth. So it's just a pretty cool little thing there. But then, so people would say, okay, well, how would all these dinosaurs fit on the ark then? You've got these T-Rexes and things like that. I mean, if he's eating like a bus-sized fish, that's a big dinosaur. Just the amount of birds alone that we've got today would be too many to fit on the ark. And this is where we would refer back to the evolution section. Would Noah have needed to have room for 2 of every kind of bird, dog, and cat? Would he have to have, 2 wolves and 2 dogs and 2 coyotes? Or would he just have to have 2 of a dog kind, and then since the flood, have we gotten those different kinds of dogs? If he only had to have 2 of every kind, in the family category, then there would have been more than enough room for every animal. It would have actually been, there would have been more room than was needed. It would have only been about half full. And this is including the dinosaurs. There would have only been about 160 dinosaurs, 160 different kinds of dinosaurs. And you got to remember, he didn't have to get all of the sea animals, just land-dwelling animals. And also, it goes farther than that. It's not just 2 of every kind. It's 2 of every unclean animal, a pair of every unclean animal, and 7 pairs of every clean animal. So there was actually more than people think. And so if it was 2 of every kind or 7 pairs of every kind, then after the flood, these animals would then spread across the world, populating the world, and the wolves that went to the Arctic, maybe they developed white hair, and became there foxes that come from that, and those who went to the more temperate climates, developed light, like tan hair, like for desert environments or what have you. But all that was needed was just the original 2 to get what we see today. All of these little adaptations over thousands of years, and to adapt to the climates or the environment or the change in diet. But so people would say, you mean to tell me that Noah had a big giant T-Rex on the ark? I would say no, because people forget that reptiles grow their entire life. So these T-Rexes that we see in museums or in movies, those would have been fully grown, adult T-Rexes. But God didn't tell Noah to bring only fully grown animals onto the ark. They more likely would have been adolescents, just because they would have been healthier, they would have eaten less, and they would have been smaller. In fact, the average size of full-grown dinosaurs, average them all up, is only the size of a bison. And when they did the calculations on how much room they would need for all of these animals on the ark, and they were very, very generous with the number. Better to go too much and overshoot and to see how much room was needed than undershoot. They would have only taken up half the space in the ark. And if the animals were adolescents, it's even better. The average size of the dinosaur would have been that of a chicken. The interesting thing here is that there's still a lot of room on the ark, and I think that's because God prepared room for others to be saved. It wasn't just Noah and his family were the only ones that were that chose to accept God's promise and his salvation. But it says in, let me find it, in verse, I'll find it. Well, I don't have the verse here, but the scripture tells us that Noah was a godly man and preached to those around him. So it's likely that Noah was spreading, telling everyone, preaching to them, hey, God's going to flood the earth. You need to come into this ark. And people were just like, whatever, crazy guy. Noah was also supposed to build just one door on the side of the ark. And this one door is the only door which any human or animal could enter into the ark. Just like Jesus is the only door that we can go through in order to be saved today. But people still had to choose to enter. There are representatives of every kind of animal present, and they all have to come through this one door. And the day in verse 13, when it says, on that same day when the rain began to fall on the earth, Noah and his family entered the ark, and everyone else could have entered that door as well and chose not to until it was too late. God closed the door, and they perished. Some people ask, why weren't dinosaurs mentioned in the Bible? But that's because Sir Richard Owen, who's the man that named dinosaurs, he didn't name them dinosaurs until 1841. The King James Version of the Bible was written 230 years prior to that. Ancient taxonomy, or classifications for organisms, is just that. It's ancient taxonomy. So the things that people called animals back then could be very different than what we call them today. People would refer to bats as birds, just because birds back then were just meant to refer to any flying creature, not what we classify them as today. Today we think of a feathered, beaked, egg-laying animal, but back then that may not have been what they were referring to. Dinosaurs and all the other animals were originally made as vegetarians. The Bible says that death did not enter the world until Adam and Eve first sinned, so that means animals were not eating each other. And this can be a hotly debated topic because skeptics say, well, dinosaur bones show that all these dinosaurs had sharp teeth. And if something has sharp teeth, that's how we know if it's a carnivore or not, or an omnivore. And depending on what the teeth shows is what kind of food they ate. But the problem is we can't really trust that example because there's animals today that have sharp teeth but are strictly herbivores, such as pandas, certain kinds of bats, hippos, gorillas. There's something called the saber-toothed deer, baboons, camels, and many more. Another explanation for this, though, is that sin brought changes into the world, all kinds of changes. Death. It could have caused these changes to the animals' teeth because then they started eating each other. Thorns didn't exist before sin entered the world. Now they did cancer or birth defects. All these things came in the world later. There are these carvings of dinosaurs in places like the Angkor Temple, and this looks very much like a stegosaurus. And this was from the 11th century in Cambodia. So that's more evidence that dinosaurs were around post-flood, because how would they know to carve a dinosaur? And these are not all mythological creatures that they're carving. There's others right around it that are all creatures that we are still around today, such as the water buffalo, the lion, a monkey. So it's not like these were mythological creatures. They were carving creatures they had seen. Well, why are they not around today? Why are there no dinosaurs around today? Animals go extinct every year, and we're not ever really that surprised about it. So it shouldn't be surprising that dinosaurs could have gone extinct either. I think that either they died out because of a lack of food after the flood. It probably took time for the vegetation to bounce back. With the amount that they ate, even if there was vegetation, they probably couldn't migrate like other animals. Or they were hunted to extinction by man, and this could be like where the stories of knights fighting dragons come from. The climate also would have seriously cooled down after the flood, resulting in the Ice Age. And if the temperature was too low, they wouldn't be able to produce enough babies, and they would gradually die off. Okay, so now I'll talk about the global flood. So the majority of young Christians today do not believe that the Bible is inerrant. And when they polled 20-somethings that attend church, it showed that the main reason many of them would say that they don't think the Bible is inerrant is because of the book of Genesis. And why is that? I mean, why do kids have such a hard time believing the book of Genesis in particular? You know, as they become adults, they begin to waver in this belief that they had as kids. Well, if you look at the books that we have for kids regarding Noah's Ark, you find these multitude of books that just seem fairy tale-ish. You know, I mean, look at this ark. It's a bathtub type ark. All the animals are crammed on there. It's not believable by any stretch of the mind. And this is giving kids the impression as they get older that this is just a story. It's not an account of history. But in the event of a global flood, there'd be many changes to how the earth operated. You know, things that would happen. People think the radiation levels would have been skyrocketing. All these different things would have happened. Tectonic plates would have been shifting faster, much, much faster. Volcanic activity would have been much more frequent. New sea crust would begin to form because it was hot, and as hot crust rises, it raises up, and that raises the sea level. All over the world, we find these large coal seams and large mammals buried with sea creatures. Creation scientists believe in something called ecological zonations, which says that mammals and humans lived on higher ground than dinosaurs, which accounts for why we see them fossilized on top of dinosaurs. We've never found humans fossilized with dinosaurs because in the flood, the dinosaurs would have been the first to have been overtaken by the water at their lower elevation. And here's kind of an example here. So you've got, you know, the sea animals in the sea. Obviously, you got some smaller animals and birds, lizards on the marshes. Dinosaurs are a little higher, and then humans and large mammals would have been up above them. So that's kind of the theory. When the crust began to cool and the wind started to kick up, that would make the waters recede. After the heating up of the crust made the water level raise. So, you know, if the heating up of the crust made the water levels raise, the cooling of the crust would make it decrease, and also volcanic activity make new earth rise. You'd have these really deep valleys, and some people say, well, where did all that water go from the flood? Earth is covered in water. It's mostly water, and so no one's saying the water disappeared. It's still there. The other interesting thing is wherever you go in the world, ancient peoples have a common flood story in their past or in their history. And it may vary, but it's just interesting. You know, you find that same story among all these different cultures. So I'll talk about the Ice Age a little bit. The Genesis flood also provides a straightforward explanation for the Ice Age. The heat generated by the rapid formation of completely new seafloor during the flood would have significantly warmed the world's oceans, and this would dramatically increase the global evaporation. And this would put far more moisture into the atmosphere than we see today, resulting in greatly enhanced snowfall at higher altitudes or latitudes and on top of mountaintops. Late flood and residual post-flood volcanic activity would have put great amounts of light-reflecting aerosols in the stratosphere, causing cooler summers, and that would allow thick sheets of ice to persist and grow over hundreds of years. And then as the ocean floor cooled and volcanic activity diminished, the Ice Age would have gradually come to an end. In contrast, the secular explanation for the Ice Age has many holes in it, many things that they are not able to explain, whereas the Christian explanation, there are no holes in it. So next I'll talk about Mount St. Helens, because this is an important topic. It provides us a real-time example of how long it takes an ecosystem to recover from a sterilization event. When it exploded, it released an amount of energy that's equivalent to 200 Hiroshima atomic bombs. It was devastating. All the trees were ripped bare, bark and all, and it has been described by people who visited afterwards as a lunar landscape. Everything within a 230 square mile radius was destroyed in a matter of 5 to 9 minutes. Ash was spread to 11 states and 2 Canadian provinces. Gas, ash, and rock were heated to over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and everything was killed, including 57 people. I've got another slide here. This is just kind of scale of how vast the area was that was affected. We can use what we observe from this living laboratory to help explain how the world recovered after the flood. That's what's important about this. Many centuries were not required to turn a devastated landscape into a lush ecosystem. 35 years later, this picture was taken. The left shows everything covered in soot and totally destroyed, and on the right, it's just a lush forest again. There's other pictures, I don't have it, of this one here, just covered in beautiful flowers and vegetation now. Not that right there, because that's a lake, but everywhere else around it. When it comes to the recovery of an ecosystem, the key word is rapid. Things recover really rapidly. If you think about fires or tsunamis, the ecosystem will recover very quickly. Within 5 years of the sterilization event, several hundred elk populated the area, and showing that the recovery was really rapid. The next place I was going to talk about is Surtsey Island. This is an interesting island. It's another example of ecosystems forming really, really rapidly from a sterile environment. In 1963, volcanic activity caused this island to just sprout up out of the ocean. And there were no pre-existing vegetation, but today it's a vibrant ecosystem with over 60 different plant species. And every year we discover 20 new species of life that formed on the island. There's also the Gulf of Mexico oil spill that happened. And this was a really devastating spill. It happened in 2010. A pipeline blew in the ocean. And scientists were making some very, very apocalyptic predictions about the potential effects that this was going to have on our world. But 1 month after it happened, a microscopic cleanup crew called Alcanivorax began to eat the oil. This is a bacteria that eats oil. That's it. It just turns oil into less harmful stuff. I mean, it cleans up the oil. These are just small rod-shaped bacteria, and they specifically feed on the hydrocarbons found in crude oil. And these little guys, they reduced the amount of oil in the ocean by about half every 3 days. Today, the majority of the Gulf of Mexico is surprisingly clean, considering the expectations that everyone had on the impact of this oil spill. And this is actually evidence for the Earth being young as well, because we have a very dynamic crust. It's always moving. And then the frequency of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that we have, the odds that these oil pockets would remain totally sterile for billions of years without any of these bacteria getting in there is very, very low. If any of them got in there, worked their way in there, we'd have no oil at all today. And the other thing is, oil is an organic compound. Just like any other organic compounds, it decays. Even secular scientists claim that the oil is 150 million years old, and but oil should have decayed after just 1 million years. As we kind of wrap it all up, I know that this was not, there's no way you can do all these topics justice in 1 hour, and I'm not claiming to be an expert in any of these fields, but I hope that I've been able to present with enough evidence to at least give you some sort of framework or foundation for why Christians believe this. It's not just some blind faith belief. There's actually real scientific evidence to support this kind of thing. It's a really tough and controversial topic to talk about in 21st century America, but I think the science actually supports the view of a young earth. And to a non-believer, I think the tendency is to just say, oh, this is all nonsense, not really give it much thought at all. And that's no surprise to us. I mean, we don't follow Jesus because he's popular. We follow him because he's real, he's true, and because the evidence is there. The main issue with how we interpret Genesis is whether we're willing to take God at his word. Doesn't matter if we take God at his word when he says that Jesus walked on the water, or when Jonah was in the fish. If we can't trust God when he says, I did this, then where else are we not going to trust him in his word? We can't cherry pick truths out of his word that are just easy for us to accept. If it wasn't important, God wouldn't have put it in his word. And our belief in the book of Genesis sets the foundation for the rest of the Bible. If we can't believe the book of Genesis, we can't believe any of the books of the Bible. I personally choose to believe God, to take him at his word, and to follow him not because it's easy, but because I must. I refuse to reject God in the face of adversity or reject his word because it's unpopular. And I hope that the stuff that I've shared with you today is enough to convince you to come to the same conclusion.